Good evening. Welcome to this evening's lecture on Is It Time for a Change? The Fundamentals of the 2012 Presidential Election, sponsored by the Department of Political Science, the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and the Committee on Lectures. My name is Jim McCormick. I'm the chair of the Political Science Department, and I very much appreciate you joining us this evening. We are indeed grateful for our sponsors and their support. This lecture is now part of a quadrennial series that we've had prior to the presidential elections dating back to 2004. Our speaker tonight is Dr. James Campbell. Dr. Campbell is a distinguished professor of political science at the University at Buffalo, SUNY, and one of the nation's foremost political forecasters of elections in the country. He is well qualified to provide us these forecasts on the basis of his significant academic experience and his substantial political experience as well. His academic credentials include an A.B. degree from Bowdoin College, summa cum laude, and a Ph.D. in political science from Syracuse University. He has been an American Political Science Association Congressional Fellow. He served for 2 years as a program director at the National Science Foundation and has been past president of Pi Sigma Alpha, the Political Science National Honorary. He has published 6 books on American elections and voting behavior, including The American Campaign, U.S. Presidential Campaigns, and The National Vote. In addition, he has published 50 articles in the leading journals of political science and some 16 chapters in books on American electoral politics. His political and forecasting experience is equally impressive. Since developing his forecasting model in the 1990s, he has been a regular contributor to the biennial work on predicting election results. Moreover, he has often led the work on a special issue of PS, Political Science. That's a publication of the American Political Science Association. And this year, in the October issue, which, by the way, I just received in the mail last week, there are a whole series of forecasts, and Dr. Campbell will include some of those forecasts in his discussion tonight. Furthermore, Dr. Campbell has been the chair of the Political Forecasting Group, a group affiliated with the American Political Science Association. And finally, he is in great demand with his political forecasting during each election cycle. For example, last week, he was in Washington, D.C. at the National Press Club sharing his forecasts on this year's election. And next week, he is headed to the University of Toronto. They're also interested in American elections. After the election, he has had several appearances to discuss the results, including one scheduled for Leicester University in England for some British scholars who regularly analyze and teach, actually, American politics. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you Professor James Campbell to discuss the 2012 election with his forecasting model and actually compare his results with others.
Almost made off with the results. Well, it's my pleasure to be here this evening once again at Iowa State University, and I appreciate the invitation to share some of my thoughts about the election and with you this evening. And I'd like to thank Jim McCormick for inviting me and showing me around Ames. It's a terrific city, terrific campus. Everybody should be very proud of the university and what you do here. Also should note that I'm very pleased at the turnout tonight, given that I would think everybody in Iowa would be sick of this election at this point. We're almost a year into the, or probably over a year into the actual dealings with the candidates at different levels. And of course, we had the first game of the World Series tonight. So again, I appreciate you being here. We're less than 2 weeks away from the election, so and some of you may have already voted. I know a few of you before tonight's talk mentioned that you've already voted, and so we're right in the last chapter of this very interesting campaign. So I'd like to share a little bit of some of my ideas about the campaign and what has shaped this election. The fundamental idea that underlies my work on forecasting and my view of elections is that there are a number of fundamental factors that affect voters and how they choose between candidates, that and many of those fundamentals are in place before the campaign begins. And we can get some measurements of those fundamentals, and that helps us to predict how the campaign develops and where the election finally winds up. Let me put it in a little bit more of a context here. There are sort of two schools of thought about campaigns and elections. There's sort of the journalistic view of campaigns, of presidential campaigns. And in the journalistic view, every little movement, one way or the other, every time a candidate sneezes, it has political significance, and we're reading every little blip. I'm sure many of you, like me, monitor Real Clear Politics every day to see if Romney or Obama is up by another 1/10 of a percentage point in the cumulative polls and so forth. And so journalists and many of us who watch politics very closely have a tendency to overread significance into every little movement in a campaign. At the other end of the spectrum is the traditional political science view of campaigns. And that view is that campaigns have minimal effects on the outcome of elections. That it's a lot of hoopla and movement that's all temporary movement, but essentially we're a nation that votes along our party identifications and for the most part, and the campaigns and things like the economy really are well set beforehand. So what I've tried to do in my book, The American Campaign, is really try to reconcile these two viewpoints. The point is that there are pre-campaign fundamentals that shape the way campaigns play out and affect the vote, that these essentially make campaigns predictable themselves, and that allows us to predict elections well. Now, this idea that the fundamentals shape campaigns is not a new idea. There are very few new ideas out there, but it's an idea that essentially the raw materials of the campaign, or maybe the cards that the candidates were dealt, makes a big difference as to who wins and who loses. Paul Lazarsfeld, the famous political scientist from the 1940s, had a slightly different version of this theory, and he compared, sort of used a photography metaphor. So basically, between elections, take a snapshot of what the voters think, if you could do that, and then the campaign essentially develops that. So it plays out. The snapshot is taken. The campaign just allows that to play out. And Jim Farley, from outside the academic world, Jim Farley was kind of the mastermind or the political guru, kind of the Karl Rove of Franklin Roosevelt. And Jim Farley had what he called Farley's Law of elections. And that is that elections are decided between elections, not within a campaign. So it's really, what somebody does in office, and that's what's crucial. So what I'd like to do this evening, in about the next 40 minutes or so is talk about the fundamentals as I see them in this particular campaign, and how those actually translate into a forecasting model, how we can make it a little bit more concrete and provide some perspective in how the campaign has developed some of these fundamentals over the last few months. Well, first, there are, I think, 4 sets of fundamentals that shape American presidential elections: partisanship and ideology, presidential incumbency, the economy, and then where the public stands before the campaign begins, how they've processed what the president has done and what the challenger has done before really the general election gets underway. With respect to partisanship and ideology, we know from decades of political science research about how individuals vote that most Americans are partisans. Sometimes they don't like to admit it, but they're partisans. And most partisans loyally vote for their party's candidates. If you look at the National Election Study, which is kind of the gold standard of survey research, in 2004 and 2008, make an adjustment for actual turnout levels and the actual vote division in the election. The country is a little bit more Democratic than Republican. About 48%. These are of voters, not of everybody. These are people who actually vote. 48% Democratic, 46% Republican, and about 6% Independent. Now, this classifies, as you can see, the Independent is a small group. This classifies independents who lean toward one party or the other as partisans. And what the best research, I think, on this suggests is that people who say initially that they're independent, but then say they lean toward the Democrats, are really Democrats that are just like the idea of calling themselves independents, but they really act and think and very much like other partisans. So it's fairly even. Partisanship is near parity. We've heard a good deal about ideological polarization. There are more people who call themselves conservatives than call themselves liberals. There may be a reason for this, but one thing we know for sure is that the number of people who are moderates has declined substantially. The number of people who call themselves moderates or don't know their ideological disposition has declined substantially since the 1980s. So the country's more clearly divided than it used to be. One of the reasons for that is that the parties, when they realigned in the 1980s, became more clearly aligned with ideology. So where the parties used to mute ideological differences, now they accentuate them. And that, that draws people to the ideological extremes. Now, there's a consequence for elections here, and the consequence is that our elections, because partisanship is near parity and we have a polarized nation, elections have become closer. I compare here the last 6 elections, from 1988 to 2008, with the previous 6 elections from 1964 to 1984. And here we have the mean winning vote, the average winning vote over those 6 elections. In the 64 to 84 period, the average winner got 56.5% of the vote, of the two-party vote. That's now down to 53%. Of the elections, of the 6 elections in this period, 4 out of 6 in the earlier period were won with the winning candidate getting more than 55% of the vote. In the last 6 elections, that hasn't happened at all, 0 for 6. And the largest winning vote in the earlier period was Nixon's landslide over Senator McGovern, who passed away this past week. And Nixon got close to 62% of the popular vote, two-party popular vote. The largest win in recent elections was 1996, and in that's Bill Clinton's reelection. But he still got less than 55% of the two-party vote, and of course the standard deviation is much lower in in the current period as well. So we're, if you think about this as like a football game, really instead of playing between the 40 and 60-yard lines, or 60-yard line, the 40-yard line on one side and the 40-yard line on the other side, we're playing between the 45 and the 45. We're playing right in the middle of the field. And that's why, is one of the reasons why your votes are so crucial this time. That's why presidents and presidential candidates are visiting Iowa. They may be taking up residency here before too long. So that makes a big difference. Second fundamental is incumbency. And we know that, again, looking at history over the 20th century, let me get back here. Oh, here we go. Okay. Over the 20th century, there are 19 elections where incumbents ran for re-election. They won 14 out of 19, so a 74%. There's a 3 in 4 chance of an incumbent getting re-elected. Only 1 in 4 chance of an incumbent being defeated. Now, there's another way of looking at incumbency, and that's looking at the incumbency of a party. If a party's been in office only 1 term and is seeking a second term, Americans have been very reluctant, and this is why Obama thinks it's such a great deal here, that they've been very reluctant to turn out of office a party who's simply asking for a second term in office. So there are 11 situations of a party seeking a second term. The party seeking that second term has won 10 times and lost just once. Only Jimmy Carter lost in this circumstance. Now, there are a lot of reasons for the incumbency advantage, and I won't go through all of them here. Inertia, the value of experience, the Rose Garden strategy, that is, using the trappings of the White House, controlling the agenda, and so forth. But one I want to pay particular attention to is an advantage that a first-party term president has over his challenger, and that is there are 2 perennial themes in American politics: change and stability. Now, most candidates can only claim and use one of those themes. You're either for, stay the course, we must continue the current policy, or we need change. It's time for a change. A president whose party has been in office just 1 term and is seeking a second term is in the enviable position of being able to use both of those themes. President Obama can go to the public and say, I'm still the agent of change. I've only been in Washington for 4 years. Let me continue on to promote my agenda. On the other hand, he's also has the continuity going for him. So he's in that very enviable position. And you can see this to a certain extent when President Obama was asked what kind of grade he'd give himself for his for his presidency, and he said, "Well, at this point, I think I'd give myself an incomplete." Well, most presidents don't get an incomplete. They get a grade, one way or the other. You've passed or failed. A first-party term incumbent has the possibility of the public accepting an incomplete, and so this is a big advantage for a first-party term incumbent. The third fundamental is the economy. And the economic record of the Obama presidency is, in a word, lousy. So we have incumbency working for President Obama, and the economic record is clearly to Mitt Romney's advantage. And we can look at this in a number of ways. The first is taking a long-term perspective. What I did is I looked at economic growth rate, the GDP growth rate from the second year on in a president's term. So for President Obama, that would be the growth rate in 2010, and 11 in the first 2 quarters in 2012. And so I did that for all the presidents going back to Eisenhower's reelection in 1956. And you can see President Obama, out of the 10 presidents, President Obama ranks 8th. Every president below President Obama on this list has lost. And of the presidents above President Obama on the list, presidents who have had stronger economic growth, even one of those has lost. So this is not an asset for President Obama. The economic record is clearly a liability. 2.1% growth rate is not good. Now, you can take a shorter run perspective. You know, what's happened recently? And so I look, one thing that forecasters have found is that the growth rate in the second quarter of an election year is particularly important for setting the tone of the campaign. So we're talking about the growth rate in April, May, and June of, so it's leading in to the campaign season. And so this would be, the news about this would be breaking in July and August and even in September. The growth rate at this point is 1.3%. That's the last quarter that we have economic numbers on. In a week or so, we'll have the preliminary numbers on the third quarter. But at this point, President Obama ranks 10th out of 11 presidents. Only Jimmy Carter had a worse economy going in to the fall campaign. And again, there have been presidents. Gerry Ford had a growth rate of 3%, and he lost. So everyone with a worse economy has lost, and there are even some, in this case one, who's had a better economy who was unable to win re-election. If you step back a little bit more and look at the average growth rate in non-recession quarters, again going back to Harry Truman, since that's when we first had this kind of data, the average growth in non-recession quarters from Truman to George W. Bush was 3.8 percentage points. That's annualized. Under Obama, it's 2.1. So about half the normal growth rate. And you can look at other indicators, because the unemployment number has been used, number of people on food stamps, the growing national debt. If you look at the economy in any which way you look at it, it's bad news for the Democrats and President Obama. So the question is, are there explanations, what Democrats would call explanations, what Republicans would call excuses, for this economic record? And I think there are 3 plausible explanations or escape hatches for President Obama. First is, and you've heard all these before, I think Bill Clinton probably did a better job of elaborating this than anyone. First is that President Obama inherited an economic catastrophe from Bush. And so that was sort of lets him off the hook. He wasn't responsible for this. Second is congressional Republican obstructionism has prevented President Obama from producing a stronger economic record. And finally, there's the argument that the economic mess was simply too big to fix in one term, and that the economy is in fact improving. So that ties into this first party term incumbent, that you just give me more time and we'll work our way out of this. Well, as to the first escape hatch, it's true. There's no question about it that President Obama inherited an economic mess from George W. Bush. But he has had 4 years to get out of it. And the Bush recession actually ended. This is the economists, the Council of Economic, there's a group that actually identifies when recessions start and stop. They identified the recession as ending in June of 2009. So we've had a long period since then. What we're experiencing is not really a recession. It is a very, very anemic recovery. So that's the first response to that. In terms of congressional Republican obstructionism, that's true. There's no question about it. When the Republicans get out there and say that one of their first goals is to make sure President Obama is a one-term president, it's kind of hard to argue that they're not obstructing. On the other hand, the Democrats controlled Congress with big majorities before the 2010 midterm. So he basically had a blank check for 2 years. And other presidents, certainly, part of the job of being president is dealing with Congress. And that's not always easy to do. So the third option is he needs more time. It's too big a mess to solve in 4 years. Simply needs more time. And President Clinton at the Democratic National Convention put it nicely. He said, no president, not me, not any of my predecessors, no one could have fully repaired the damage that he found in just 4 years. So I went back and see. Well, we know Franklin Roosevelt inherited a huge mess from Herbert Hoover. It was called the Great Depression. What happened in the second year of Franklin Roosevelt's administration? The economy was growing at 10.9% in 1934 was the second year of the first Roosevelt term. 10.9%, Obama 2.4%. Third year, 8.9%, Obama 1.8%. And the third year, or the fourth year rather, it was 13% versus 1.7%. Now they're different circumstances, but you had both presidents facing economic difficulties, and the records are so vastly different. It's hard to believe. So I think that's a hard sell, that we shouldn't be in a better situation than we are in. And also, we can look more directly. Is there evidence that the economy is improving? Well, we can. You look around and there's not much good news on this. The Conference Board and the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia both have forecasts for 2013. The forecast growth rate for GDP in next year is 1.4% to 2.1%. Again, a good economy is growing around 3 or 4%. If you're going to actually get some jobs moving. So I think what we have here is a situation where President Obama has some of his responsibility for the economy has been muted by using the escape hatches. People still blame President Bush a good deal for the economic problems, but President Obama is not completely let off the hook. I think what we have here is sort of muted responsibility. The first party term incumbent, again, the voters are likely to give that incumbent a little bit more slack than they would a president who's served in office more for a longer period of time. And because of that, if you looked at the hard economic numbers, you'd figure Mitt Romney would just have a double-digit lead over President Obama. But if you look at the subjective estimates of the economy, he has a lead, but it's much more restrained, much smaller lead. Who would do a better job handling the economy? Look at 2 Gallup polls. Romney has a slight edge, but only a slight edge, not as big as one might have guessed. The fourth fundamental is the pre-campaign politics and public opinion. And we know Mitt Romney, nobody knows better than you folks, that Mitt Romney had a hard time going through the caucuses and getting the Republican nomination. While President Obama was uncontested, essentially coronated as the Democratic candidate, Romney survived an anybody but Romney movement where Herman Cain and Michelle Bachmann and, I don't know who, it's hard to say who wasn't a Republican frontrunner at some point along the way. And they survived, the Romney Super PAC survived that, but it took its toll. And it indicates that at least there's some reluctance about supporting, or there was some reluctance about supporting Governor Romney early on by a large segment of his party. We see that Romney did not achieve 40% in the polls among Republicans until 36 primaries and caucuses had already been completed. So a lot of Republicans were dragged along, screaming, and had to be pulled to the Romney candidacy. And so we have in Mitt Romney a somewhat flawed candidate on the Republican side that lacks some of the charisma. At least this explains why he may have gotten off to a very slow start. Further evidence of public opinion before the campaign is looking at approval ratings. We see by, again, the historical comparisons, Barack Obama is right about at the cusp between the winners and losers. Below Obama on the scale is Jerry Ford, who lost, Jimmy Carter, who lost, and George H.W. Bush, who lost in 1992. All had approval ratings in mid-July below 46%. Of those who had higher approval ratings, 47% and above, all of those candidates won. Obama in mid-July was right at the dividing line, right at the point of winning and losing. We also can look at pre-convention preference polls. Barack Obama, before either the Republicans or the Democrats started their conventions, Obama standing in the Gallup poll was 49.5% of the two-party division. Again, that's right about where one of the Bushes lost the election with a better approval poll. The other Bush won with a better. But again, it's right at that dividing line. So pre-campaign public opinion was divided. What do we see in summing up the fundamentals? Partisanship and ideology, it suggests a very close election. The pre-campaign public opinion suggests a close election. And then we have two fundamentals that are kind of offsetting one another. We have incumbency, which clearly favors President Obama. Americans are reluctant to turn out an incumbent, particularly an incumbent whose party's only been in office for 4 years. On the other hand, we have Governor Romney, who benefits from the economy. So the forecast models make this a little bit more concrete. I have two equations that forecast the election, and the models predict the national two-party presidential popular vote for the in-party candidate. So we're looking at the two-party split. Third parties don't matter here. We're looking at the in-party candidate, and we're looking at the popular vote, not the electoral vote. And the two equations are the trial heat and economy equation, which I'll explain in a minute, and the convention bump and economy equation. First, the trial heat and economy equation. Again, these are really ways of taking the fundamentals and getting hard measurements of them and looking at how they've played out over history. The trial heat and economy equation is based on two predictors. First, the trial heat poll, the Gallup trial heat poll at around Labor Day. So this is the two-party division for the in-party candidate. And the second indicator is the economy. It's the second quarter growth rate in the real GDP. And the reading of that's available for forecasting is the August revision from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. And there's some adjustment for this to take into account open seat races. So it's centered and it's halved for an open seat race. But of course, this election we have an incumbent in the race, so that doesn't really come into play. The accuracy of this model is we try to assess that by estimating the model, leaving an election out, and then try to essentially simulating what a forecast would have been for that election, looking at the error. And so we do that for each election. That's what it's called an out-of-sample error. And the median out-of-sample error is 1.2 percentage points. I've been using this model since the 1992 election. And so we have some sort of real-time experience. The mean error is 2.4 percentage points. The 2008 election is excluded from that, and I'll comment on that in a moment. Second model is the convention bump model, and this model I developed in 2004. The reason for this, developing a second model, the first model is perfectly fine, but the problem is the parties kept moving their conventions later and later in the year and essentially encroaching on Labor Day. And so that essentially contaminated the Labor Day polls, because a lot of the poll reading right after a convention is ephemeral. You know, there's some enthusiasm that's built up as a result of the conventions that subsides rather quickly. So you don't want to consider that like real poll numbers the same way you would have considered it previously. So what I did in this case is use a trial heat poll before the conventions, the net convention bump, and the economy. And the average area here is 1.6 percentage points. Essentially, you can consider these forecasts to be kind of a sophisticated reading of the polls, taking the historical relationship of the polls into account, how they, how poll readings, preference poll standings at one point relate to the vote later on throughout the history of elections. The competitiveness of the presidential races, the polls tend to narrow as the convention approaches, and presidential incumbency in the economic context of the campaign. What's distinctive about these models is that they're not purely retrospective. They don't just look at the past like a lot of other models do. They just look at approval ratings or the economy. So I do take into account the other candidate as well. Well, there are two complications in 2012. I'll just note these quickly since we're running a little late here. I exclude the 2008 election because it really was an aberrant election. The Wall Street meltdown happened right in the middle, between the time the forecast was made and the election was held. So that, that's like, so think of it this way. If 9/11 had happened in 2004, would anybody really seriously think that a forecast made before 9/11 could predict an election result after 9/11? No, it would not make any sense. So 2008 election is excluded, and so I use the convention bump model as a preferred model as well, because the parties now have not only moved their conventions later, they've even started after Labor Day. So that made them less useful. The trial heat model was less useful. This is actually what the model looks like. Getting to the forecast, made 57 days before the election, it predicted Barack Obama would get 51.3% of the vote. Mitt Romney would get 48.7%. There was about a two-thirds chance of Obama getting more than 50% of the vote, right? So there's 50% chance that he'd get over 51.3, and then there's about a 17% chance that he gets between 50 and 51.3. So that's how you get the 67%. Now, since then, we have an update using the more recent estimate by the Bureau of Economic Analysis of GDP growth that dropped from 1.7% down to 1.3%, and using Gallup's mid-October poll reading, 49.9% for Obama of registered voters, it comes to essentially 50-50. So essentially, it's a coin toss. That's what the model, the October model says, is that there's a coin toss. I think we don't have much. I want to get to questions in a moment here, but I think the key to this, and these are some of the other forecasting models, they all tend to cluster around 50%. This is a summary of all of the forecasting models. On the high side, they predicted 53.8% for Obama. On the low side for Obama, the high side for Romney, it was 53.1% Romney. So again, between like the 47-yard line and the 47-yard line. I mean, actually, Romney is not a forecaster, but that 47% speech that he gave was pretty much on target. That's 47% of the country won't vote for Romney. 47% won't vote for Obama. We have a very polarized country, and we have two candidates that have offsetting advantages. President Obama has the incumbency advantage and all the goodwill that entails, and Mitt Romney is running against an incumbent with a weak economic record. So the median forecast is right about in the middle, 50.6% for Obama. 5 of the forecasts predicted an Obama plurality, but 3 of those were right on the cusp between an Obama prediction and a toss-up prediction. 5 forecast a Romney plurality, and 3 actually forecast a toss-up. They were so close to predicting 50-50 that they couldn't really be said to have favored either Romney or Obama. Just one quick word before we go to some questions about the electoral vote. What we have now is an electoral system that is focused laser-like on you. We have about 10 or 11, well, 9 to 11 states that are battleground states. Certainly Florida, Ohio, and Virginia get a lot of the attention, but Iowa is certainly, they're battling for every single electoral vote out there. Obama, at least in this reading, starts with about 217 electoral votes, and he needs about 53 more to win. And Romney starts with 206 and needs 64 to win. Essentially what we have is a campaign in which Romney favors to the extent that this is considered a retrospective election. That is, evaluating the incumbent's record and how well the incumbent has done or not done, whether the incumbent's held accountable. For Obama, it's a much more likely, he wants the election to be seen as a prospective election and giving the incumbent a little bit more time. And that's the battle over the next 2 weeks. Have some readings of the inflection points, but this is what the media kind of reads in the election. Every little up and down, every little curve. The key event, at least at this point, appears to be the first presidential debate. Going into the first presidential debate, in Real Clear Politics polls, President Obama had a 3-point lead. 67% to 72%, depending on which poll you look at, indicated that Romney won the election, won the debate at this point. The more important question, though, a more important result, was the question about who did the debate make you feel more likely to vote for. And on that question, this was crucial. 35% thought that they were more likely to vote for Romney after that debate, 18% for Obama. The debates since have been about even, 25% on either side. Now, you could chalk up the debate to be one of those idiosyncratic factors that affect elections from time to time. I think it's much more clearly interpreted as the playing out of one of these fundamentals, that the economy finally surfaced as more clearly to voters as a result of the first debate, and that had not happened before then. Well, I also have some slides on the congressional elections, but why don't we move to questions now? Questions that you might have about the presidential contest. And I think there's a microphone in the middle. Yes.
Do you ever see any significant impact vice presidential candidates have on the election?
That the vice presidential? No, I haven't seen any effect of the vice presidential candidates on this election. And it's very rare. Where the research suggests that vice presidents can be helpful in their home states. You can get a home state advantage of 1 or 2 percentage points from a vice presidential candidate, but that's about it. In earlier days, it made a difference in southern states, but that are the the region to pick a southern candidate. But those days seem to be gone now. Right. I don't think that's the case. I think what we saw was that there was a boost for McCain after the Republican convention that stayed in place. Actually, I can go back to the numbers on this. That's it. Yeah, here we see. This is 2008, the Wall Street meltdown's political meltdown. Before the debates in early to mid-August, Obama had about a 3-point lead over McCain. Before the conventions, that had dropped down to about 1.2 percentage points in the Real Clear Politics average. And here we see, to some extent, the Palin effect, the initial Palin effect, which shifted from Obama having a slight lead to McCain coming out of the conventions with a 4-point lead over Obama. Now, you'd figure some of that would dissipate. Some of the convention effects recede rather quickly. But that's a rather sizable shift in that short period. So I think on balance, she was an asset but only slightly so. I think what it indicated to many conservatives in the party who were disenchanted with McCain was that McCain was acceptable, that he would reach across to deal with conservatives, and I think that helped him. So it was maybe not so much Palin as Palin was symbolic of that opening to conservatives. Yes. Oh, yeah, I don't know whether you need to use the... Well, I guess you could just talk from there. Yeah.
If I was paying attention correctly, your models predict the national popular vote.
Right.
How do you translate that into the electoral college vote?
Well, I don't translate that directly. What we see in the electoral college is lumpy, right? We know that in most states it's winner take all, and the distribution can shift a little bit from state to state, and that can change things. We know overall from history that whoever wins the popular vote is very, very likely to win the electoral vote. But it's lumpy enough that I wouldn't even try to predict the electoral vote. There's just a lot of error. As you know, a shift of 1,000 votes in a couple states can make a huge difference. Yes.
I actually have two questions there, if I may respond. First off, how don't you come to the mic?
Yeah, okay.
Behind you
Yes.
can hear you. Thank you very much.
Is it on?
I think it's on. You could speak into it.
Okay. First question is, how do you use third-party candidates to intertwine into your data? And then second question is, when do you see a third-party candidate out in the future making a major impact on the presidential election?
Well, our experience is that third-party candidates don't affect the predictive accuracy of the models, my model or other models. To some extent, they're drawing from both sides. To some extent, they're bringing out people who wouldn't have been voting otherwise. So whatever effect they have seems to be well within the normal range of error for any of these models. The models are, typically 1.5 to 2.5 points off. Even in that, they're doing better than the polls are doing from Labor Day or earlier. So we don't really consider third-party support or third-party votes in the models. As to when third parties are likely to be important in the future, I think it's unlikely that they'll be very important for some time. And the reason for that is that the parties, they go back to the fundamentals. The parties are evenly balanced. That means the parties are fighting for the votes and the support of everybody, including those who might be attracted to a third-party candidate. And also, we have a country that's very ideologically polarized. So what that means is that conservatives are very much afraid of the Democrats winning office, and Democrats are afraid of the Republicans winning office, or liberals are very afraid of Republicans winning office. And because of that, there are less, kind of the wasted vote argument carries more weight. You know, that you don't want to do anything that could possibly enable your last choice, or your, you know, what you see as the most detrimental to the national interest, winning the election. So I think the days of third-party candidates aren't. It's very unlikely to see a third-party candidate of any significance in the near future. Other questions?
You're asking, is it time for a change? And I was hoping, given the obscene amounts of money that we see in this election, as well as the fact that the Electoral College doesn't actually give us one person, one vote, if you think it's time for a change in general in how we elect our presidents.
Well, let's see. I should never fool around with this. I think it's... in terms of the money in politics, I think there has to be dramatic campaign finance reform. Not the usual kind, though. I think what we have to recognize is that money is going to find its way into politics. It would be better if it went directly to candidates and was more transparent and accountable and used in a way that was where its use could be accountable, than to have it go to super PACs, where essentially you have a secondary campaign being conducted by people who are not in the race. So we need to change the campaign financing system a good bit. I think I should also mention here is that I don't think it's a good idea to try to restrict money in politics. You know, what do we know about supply and demand? The one thing we know is if you restrict the supply of something, you make it more valuable. So what we should be doing is making sure that both candidates, all candidates, have plenty of money to run their campaigns, but that they control the money. As to the Electoral College, I think we need to figure out a better way to run things. We shouldn't be focusing on elections. We should take some of the burden off the people in Iowa to decide our president, and spread that around a little bit. So we should try to make some changes there. I'm not sure I'd go easily to a popular election for president, since I think there are a lot of issues about possible corruption and ballot tampering and so forth. So if we can make sure that the ballots, you know, we have one person, one vote, and we can keep good track of that and make sure that it's an honest vote, then I think we can move in that direction. But I lived in Louisiana too long to simply hand things over to one state, where one state could just roll up the vote for one candidate or the other. So I'd be wary of that. Yes.
Yeah, well, I noticed in both of your models that the economy is sort of of prime importance in both of those. So I guess, is this lending credence to Ferguson's investment theory of politics? And could you comment on the aptness, I guess, of that particular theory, investment theory of politics?
Well, I think I'd first take exception to the idea that the economy is so important here. The economy is a factor. It's one of many factors, and if you look at my model, the presidential preference polls are much more important, and that takes a whole range of considerations into account. Essentially allows voters to determine, well, if they're interested in the abortion issue or immigration or energy or something else, and that affects their initial inclination toward one candidate or the other. And so it's not just the economy, and even when you look at the economy, it's not simply dollars and cents. To some extent, the economy, the state of the economy tells us something about the climate, the political climate in the country. If the economy is doing well, people are just more receptive to everything the in-party candidate has to say. If the economy is going poorly, they're looking more skeptically at everything the in-party candidate has to say about everything. If things are going poorly, the electorate just gets in a sour mood. They're more inclined to want change. And so I think that's a part of what the reason why the economy is an important consideration. It's not just dollars and cents in that way.
I'm assuming you're fairly familiar, or at least somewhat familiar with the 538 forecast run by Nate Silver.
All right, yeah.
I was wondering if you could comment on how that model is different than yours to the extent you've studied it, and if you could, any sort of criticisms you might have of it based on what you know.
Well, actually, Nate is sort of, he's kind of become a celebrity forecaster, but he's also brand new to the business and doesn't make a lot of what he does transparent. So it's not very clear. Nate Silver does forecasting. First, he started as a blogger, and the New York Times picked up his 538 column. So it's hard to compare. He learned a lot from the last 20 years or 25 years of election forecasting, and a lot of what he has to say is simply what we've been working on for many years. But that said, it's not exactly clear what he's doing, so I can't compare one-on-one his model to mine.
I think one of the most interesting things is how close the elections have drawn together over time. And I'm wondering, what do you think has contributed to the loss of the moderates? Where has the middle gone?
Well, I think the key here is that the parties, beginning in it was a kind of a staggered realignment from the late 60s really up to 1994 when the Republicans took control of the House for the first time in 40 years. There was a realignment in that period that sorted out the parties. That the South, which was fairly conservative, moved from being a Democratic region to a Republican region. That made both of the parties more ideologically homogeneous. The South had previously made the Democratic Party a mix of Northern liberals and Southern conservatives. When the South moved out, the Republican Party became more conservative, the Democratic Party became more liberal. And at the same time, actually slightly preceded this, the Republicans lost strength in a lot of northern areas. And so you had a lot of northern liberal Republicans, people like Jacob Javits, and if you go to Massachusetts, when I was growing up in New England, Massachusetts was a fairly Republican state, if you can believe it. But it was liberal Republicans. And so you had those liberal Republicans being displaced with liberal Democrats. And so both parties became more homogeneous, and that sorted out the electorate as well. So you had people who might have been moderated in their political views because they were in a party that was more heterogeneous, became more extreme when they were in parties that were more politically homogeneous. So, and I think that's a big part of this. And it sort of highlighted ideology. Ideology became almost synonymous with the parties, whereas in the past it hadn't been. I mean, there's a classic book that was written in the early 1980s, I believe, or mid-1980s, called Issue Evolution. And this was primarily on racial politics in Congress, but it extended well beyond that. And they looked at voting on racial issues in both the House and the Senate in both parties across time. And what you see is the lines cross in the early and mid '60s. That the Republican Party had been the more liberal party on civil rights issues up until Kennedy and Johnson, and at which point the two lines crossed. And that led, I think, or that was part of this realignment process that ended up sorting the parties, making both parties more ideologically distinct. And there was now no comfortable home for moderates. And moderates were kind of chose up sides, one way or the other. Yes. Well, I think the Tea Party, I think whenever a party grows in size, you're going to have more extremes. And I think the Tea Party are the frustrated conservatives in the Republican Party. And I think they have some benefits and some costs to the party. There's certainly what we used to call political amateurs. They're very policy oriented. They're anti-compromise. They make life difficult for the establishment and the party. Some of that's for the good. Some of it's for the bad. But I think they're here to stay. I think the Democrats have something of the same sort in their party. There are ideological wings of both parties that are sort of my way or the highway kind of thinking, and that puts a lot of pressure on the parties to deliver to their bases, which is not altogether a bad thing, not to compromise too easily, but you do need compromise in a system to work. So to the extent that they're completely unrealistic, that makes the chances of gridlock far too high. Yes?
I don't see in your model, but it may be there, a couple of factors that are traditional. I believe I think I'm right that Campbell et al., that's the other Campbell et al.,
Right, okay.
had partisanship, candidate image, and issues as the three factors that they focus on.
Right.
I think that issues clearly have mattered. For example, Obama ran as the anti-war in Iraq candidate. It then became a non-issue when the economy went to hell. But candidate image, I think, shows a great deal. Mr. Romney campaigned for 5 years here in Iowa and lost to Huckabee in 2008.
Right.
And barely beat or lost to Santorum this time. And as you showed, it took, 36 primaries before he even got to 40%.
Right.
And the candidate image issue is the first debate where Obama presumably didn't do very well. Although when I watched it, I thought he didn't do very well, but I didn't think he stunk up the place the way the media people said. But what about right track, wrong track for issues and candidate image? Are they in your model? And one little thing, I think using Gallup is strange, although reliability is more important than validity. But Gallup is rather well known to be 2 percentage points more Republican than the electorate. Did you use a lot of polls and we just are looking at the Gallup results? And if they're reliable, and it doesn't really matter that they're off, of course.
Right. First, with respect to partisanship issues, candidate image, all of that goes into the funnel that comes into the preferences of voters. Presumably, to the extent that partisanship is important, and I think it's extremely important, it should be reflected in the preference poll standings of the candidates as issues and images of the candidates should as well. If somebody is seen as a stronger leader, a more effective leader, and so forth, that should be reflected in the preference poll numbers for that candidate. So I don't think that's a problem. That's part of the fundamentals. If we had a lot of great data over 50 elections or 80 elections as opposed to 15 or 16 elections, then maybe we could look at the various components. But I think the preference poll does a great job of actually allowing voters to weight those considerations like partisanship and issues for themselves, and that determines whether candidates do well in the Labor Day or the post-convention polls. As to Gallup, I mean, I'm not sure that there are two reasons to use Gallup. One is the model's estimated going back to 1948. Gallup is the only horse in town here that was running back in 1948. So in order to estimate the model over a number of elections, you have to use Gallup. There's no other alternative. If there is some bias in Gallup, and I'm not so sure that there is, but if there is some bias, it should show up in by the statistical analysis. And we simply haven't seen that the model under-predicts for Democrats or over-predicts for Republicans. So it seems to me that the Gallup, at least from looking at it historically, and taking and discounting, of course, we're discounting a good deal of the lead too. So whatever error might be there is muted by the fact that if a candidate is up by 10 points at Labor Day, we're suggesting that they only get about a 5-point vote advantage. So the lead is essentially cut in half if you look at the model here, the trial heat model. So this is telling us right here that only 46% of that lead gets translated into the vote. So that kind of mutes any kind of effect as well. But it's more necessity than choice here. There wasn't. You didn't have Rasmussen or any of the others available 50 years ago. One or two more questions?
If not, I'd like to invite everybody to a little reception afterwards, and Dr. Campbell will be available for any questions you might have.
Great. Thank you.